Hello and welcome.
Thank you for joining us today. My name is Clare Payne. I'm the web librarian and liaison to the art department at Stony Brook University. I'm so excited to welcome all of you to this first lecture of the Fall Art and Focus series, where Helen Harrison will be speaking on Jackson Pollock and jazz. The Art and Focus series is co-presented by the Stony Brook University Libraries and the Pollock-Krasner House and Study Center. We'd like to extend our thanks to the Herman Goldman Foundation and Stony Brook's John H. Marburger III Fund for supporting the series. Though typically we host these lectures at the SBU Southampton campus library, it's happy to see so many of you via this virtual method, and so glad we could present the series this fall. And now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker and the coordinator of this series, Helen Harrison. Helen is the Eugene V and Clare E Thaw Director of the Pollock-Krasner House and Study Center, a former art reviewer and feature writer for the New York Times and an NPR art commentator. She has been the curator of the Parrish Art Museum and Guildhall Museum and has taught at the School of Visual Arts and currently holds an adjunct faculty position in Stony Brook University's Department of Art. Her articles, essays, and reviews have appeared in numerous scholarly and popular publications, and she's the author of several books, including, most recently, 3 mystery novels set in the New York art world. Helen will open with her lecture, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. Until then, we ask that everybody remain muted. You're welcome to ask questions via chat throughout the lecture or by raising your hand using that little feature at the end, and Helen will be happy to answer those. So without further ado, please welcome Helen Harrison.
Thank you, Claire. This is really a wonderful opportunity. I'm so pleased to be able to participate in conjunction with Stony Brook Southampton Library. And I hope that we can all do it live again sometime soon. But the advantage, of course, of having this Zoom is that many of you can join who would not be able to come otherwise. I see that Ellen Landau is here all the way from Pasadena, so I'm very happy to see her. I have to thank Claire for putting this together, and also to note that this is a new version of a talk that I first gave for the Humanities Institute at Stony Brook back in 2008 at their Brilliant Corners Conference on Jazz and Culture. So I was glad to be able to participate in that. That was a great opportunity. This talk is going to examine the relationship between Jackson Pollock's action painting technique, which reached its apogee in 1948 to 1950, and the jazz music that he loved. His spontaneous creation of free-flowing forms is often likened to jazz improvisation, specifically the bebop that was prominent at the time, and many people believe he listened to that music while he painted. Now the question is, was Pollock responding directly to the rhythms and energies of jazz, or was the music's influence on his art a little more oblique and subtle? I want to move on to the next slide. Let's see if I can do that. There we go. When the painter Lee Krasner was asked to contribute reflections on her late husband for a 1967 magazine article titled, "Who Was Jackson Pollock?" she took the opportunity to set the record straight about a few of the misconceptions that had sprung up like weeds around Pollock's grave. By this time, 11 years after his death, the image of him as the hard-drinking, two-fisted, self-destructive action painter had solidified into myth. I'm quoting her now. "There's so much stupid myth about Pollock, I can't stand it. I'm bored with these myths," she complained. According to Krasner, his tough guy posture was bluff and bluster. He was, she said, damn decent to his friends no matter what the situation was. She also debunked his reputed inability to express himself in words. On the contrary, she knew all too well that, quote, he could be hideously verbal when he wanted to be, unquote. And she dismissed the contention that his death in a drunken car crash was actually a suicide. "There is no truth in this," she insisted. "It was an automobile accident like many others." One myth that Krasner didn't address was the image of Pollock as the embodiment of jazz music, creating his paintings while listening to records by the bebop musicians who were his contemporaries. She did, however, stress his long-standing love of jazz, which preceded by many years his breakthrough to action painting. Quote, "He would get into grooves of listening to his jazz records," she recalled, "not just for days, day and night for 3 days running, until you thought you would climb the roof. The house would shake. Jazz? He thought it was the only other really creative thing happening in this country," unquote. The other really creative thing being abstract expressionist painting. And Pollock wasn't the only contemporary visual artist who felt a kinship with the music. As noted in the catalog for the December 1946 exhibition, Homage to Jazz, at Samuel Coots's Manhattan Gallery, it featured paintings by William Baziotis, Romare Bearden, Robert Motherwell, Carl Holte, Byron Brown, and Adolf Gottlieb. And in that catalog, the essay said, "Jazz and abstract painting are the preeminent arts of this era in this country, the provocative, the original arts." Although according to Krasner, Pollock had no musical talent himself, couldn't carry a tune, and was an awkward dancer, she maintained that he had a passion for music. Indeed, he owned more than 150 records, mostly 78 RPM discs that date back to the 1930s and early 1940s. And you can see these back here in this section are the 78s. These are later ones, a few of the small format, long playing 33 1/3 records, which were introduced in the late 1940s. That would be these 10-inch ones, same size as the 78s, but with 2 or 3 tunes on a side instead of only one. And they're preserved, as you see here, at the Pollock-Krasner house in Springs in East Hampton, where the two artists settled in 1945. Only a handful of the 78s are displayed, however. Apparently, after Pollock's death, Krasner never wanted to see or hear them again. Perhaps her memories of the marathon listening sessions had soured her on them, prompting her to relegate them to the attic, where they sit to this day. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. And there they are. Under them, on the shelf, I found a newspaper dated November 15th, 1956, 3 months after Pollock died. Roasting summers and freezing winters have taken their toll on the fragile shellac discs, and even the playable ones are quite worn, bearing out Krasner's contention that Pollock incessantly listened to them. So what is this music that so captivated Pollock that he played it nonstop for days on end? And what role, if any, did it play in his creative process? Was he consistently seeking to emulate the free-flowing improvisational technique of such bebop pioneers as Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, Kenny Clark, Thelonious Monk, and Max Roach? And was he, in effect, imitating them? And did he listen to music while he painted? Well, the first three questions, the first and last question are the easiest to answer. First, what did he listen to? Pollock's jazz record collection is dominated by music that was popular in the 1920s and 1930s, when he was in his teens and 20s. It comprises primarily traditional Dixieland, New Orleans, and ragtime tunes by such major artists as James P. Johnson, Louis Armstrong, Kid Ory, Fats Waller, and Jelly Roll Morton, and some lesser known names, and this is my favorite, Nappy Lemaire's Louisiana Levee Loungers. There are also the Chicago stylings of Jack Teagarden, George Wetling, and Art Hodes, big band music by Duke Ellington, Cab Calloway, Let's see, we've got some selections here. Russell Bennett, Lionel Hampton, Artie Shaw, Benny Goodman, Eddie Condon, Teddy Wilson, Woody Herman and Count Basie. Vocals by Billie Holiday, and here's a Billie Holiday disc. Piano standards by Eddie Duchin, and folk songs by Mahalia Jackson, Burl Ives, and Josh White. According to his friend, B.H. Friedman, Pollock was not receptive to vanguard jazz. In the mid-1950s, Friedman accompanied him to clubs like Eddie Condon's in Greenwich Village, where the fare was a mix of Dixieland and Chicago style. He loved Fats Waller, Friedman told me. He used to talk about him a lot. The Pollock-Krasner house collection includes a 1952 recording by the boogie woogie piano player Jimmy Yancey, which you can see on the shelf behind the turntable. It was a gift from Friedman, who tried in vain to interest Pollock in bebop. Friedman may have been the source of this Charlie Parker LP, which bears some smudged fingerprints that are most likely Pollock's. It looks like he didn't take very good care of it. I want to thank Nick Petracco, who's the forensic analyst who searched for Pollock's DNA for an authentication project a few years ago, who kindly sent me this photograph of the record. As it happens, there's a 1947 bebop album jacket on the shelf below the hi-fi set, but the 78 RPM records inside are standards like T for Two, I Got Rhythm, and Embraceable You, played by Victor Arden, Bob Crosby, and Ben Selvin's Knickerbockers. Pollock evidently discarded the missing platters featuring Clark, Gillespie, and other boppers. The collection includes a Charlie Parker LP that was given to Pollock by his lover, Ruth Kligman, just a few weeks before his death in 1956. She assumed he'd go for it, since Parker's improvisational style seemed so in tune with Pollock's, but he didn't. She may have been crazy about him, but as far as his taste in music was concerned, Kligman told me, I thought he was a real square. That opinion was echoed by Larry Rivers, who was a professional jazz musician before he became a visual artist. Even after he gained recognition as a painter, Rivers continued to play the saxophone and organized several bands. The first one, Larry Rivers and his Mudcats, was the debut of his nom de guerre. His actual name was Yitzhak Reloiza Grossberg. He sometimes played at Jungle Pete's, a watering hole in Springs, where Pollock was a regular. Now this is Larry's talking. He'd come around in the evening from his afternoon drinking and still be there at 9 o'clock or something like that when we'd start, Rivers told Jeffrey Potter, one of Pollock's biographers. He'd ask for cornies like, I Can't Give You Anything But Love, Baby, practically on the level of dopey songs, unquote. An old show tune like that may have had no possibilities and seemed dopey to a hipster like Rivers, but it had possibilities for Louis Armstrong and his Savoy Ballroom 5, who recorded it in 1929, and that recording is in Pollock's collection. As to the question of whether Pollock listened to jazz music while he painted, the answer, contrary to myth, is no. Lee Krasner was asked about it in a 1964 television interview, and she said emphatically that he did not. Remember her description of Pollock's record-playing marathons? She said that the house would shake. There was no record player or radio in the studio. There's ample photographic documentation of the inside of the building, a converted storage barn, and you can see that it contained no wind-up Victrola or an electric turntable and amp. In fact, the studio had no electricity until 1953, by which time Pollock had already painted virtually all the dynamic poured paintings that have been likened to improvisational jazz compositions. And unfortunately, I don't have a photo that really shows it, but in a series of pictures taken right after his death in 1956, and this is one of them by Maurice Berezoff, the studio, I think Lee asked Maurice to document the studio because she knew she was going to have to deal with the estate and she wanted a record of what was in there. If you could see, which you can't, just past this director's chair, this folding chair on the left, you would see a turntable, an amplifier and a speaker on the floor, but disconnected, and no turntable. So evidently he was planning to install a record player in the studio, but simply never got around to it. And this, of course, is 1956, just before his death. So the image of him flinging paint while dancing to the syncopated rhythms of Bird or Dizzy or Monk, like the equally misguided notion that he painted while drunk, is a fanciful one. This is not to say that jazz played no part in Pollock's aesthetic repertoire. It was a well-established source of inspiration for abstract artists, mindful of Walter Pater's observation that art constantly aspires toward the condition of music. Among those cited in Donna M. Cassidy's invaluable 1997 book, Painting the Musical City, are Aaron Douglas, this is the cover illustration, Romer Bearden, Arthur Dove, Mark Tobey, Pete Mondrian, Franz Klein first, Pete Mondrian, and Stuart Davis. Now, jazz was a theme for Bearden throughout his career. Davis was a deeply devoted jazz fan who often incorporated musical imagery in his abstractions. This painting was originally done for WNYC radio, but it's now in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum. It's a WPA painting. And he did have music playing in his studio while he worked. You can see his radio. This is a plug-in one. And here's a portable from the year of his death. So you can see how consistently he was listening while he was working. In Pollock's case, however, the music acted as a respite from the creative act. His intensive work sessions would be followed by fallow periods, which became more frequent after he resumed drinking following 2 years of sobriety from 1948 through 1950. As Krasner once remarked, quote, he often said, painting is no problem. The problem is what to do when you're not painting, unquote. One of the things he did was listen to records. An intriguing question is whether there was a cause and effect between these passive listening sessions and his return to work. His friend and fellow artist, Alfonso Osorio, witnessed an occasion in 1953 when Pollock had apparently hit an impasse and tried to use music to rekindle his creative spark. As Osorio told Jeffrey Potter, quote, he had put a large black and white canvases against the windows in the front room, taken a bottle and gone in and turned the volume up full. They were all early jazz records. He did that several times, obviously experimenting with his psyche full blast, end quote. Was the music an effective stimulus? And if it was, how did it affect Pollock's painting practice? Surprisingly, given the widespread assumption that his art is analogous to jazz, little has been written on the subject. Only 2 art historians, Andrew Kagan and Chad Mandelis, have published articles specifically devoted to it, and they appeared in the 1970s in Arts Magazine. Now, Kagan focuses on the thematic and cultural parallels, while Mandelis examines the structural similarities between Pollock's paintings and the music in question, and also looks conversely at jazz musicians who have expressed an affinity with Pollock, notably the soprano sax player and composer Jane Ira Bloom, whose album Chasing Paint was inspired by Pollock's work, and Ornette Coleman, who's excuse me, let me have a little sip of water here. Let's go back. This mouse is very sensitive. There we go. Ornette Coleman, whose groundbreaking 1960 album, Free Jazz, reproduces a Pollock on the jacket. Now, Mandelis quotes Coleman as saying that he recognized in Pollock someone in the same state that I was in, doing what I was doing. According to Mandelis, it wasn't Coleman's idea to illustrate a Pollock on the cover, but whoever made that decision, surprisingly, did not choose a classic action painting like this one, which happens to be my personal favorite, with flowing forms and interlacing linear rhythms, but opted instead for the 1954 canvas White Light, from late in Pollock's career when he had retreated from the spontaneous pouring technique that made him famous. White Light is notable for its heavy impasto and staccato strokes. Still, it could be argued that its multiple overlays of color and texture correspond to the dense harmonics, chromatic variety, and vibrant nervous energy of Coleman's free jazz idiom. In his 1979 Arts Magazine article, Andrew Kagan points to the indigenous American character of jazz as a potent source of its appeal for Pollock, and theorizes that its ascent into the cultural mainstream, both at home and abroad, paved the way for Pollock's art to be ratified. According to Kagan, and quote, ambitious improvisation was precisely what made jazz such a significant novelty in Europe, where it came to symbolize the wildness and freedom associated with the New World. That's a frequent stereotype, and gained widespread popularity decades before American visual art was taken seriously. After World War II, Pollock benefited from perfect timing. As Kagan puts it, quote, to Europeans who recognized a lapse in their own artistic innovation and leadership, he appeared as a new prophet to revitalize and save the Western tradition in art, unquote. I think Kagan is right in supposing that, quote, the fact that Pollock was wilder, more passionate, and his art more electric, more immediate, and more improvisatory in character than that of his contemporaries, surely aided him in becoming the first American painter to win that type of acceptance, end quote. The most frequent analogy between Pollock and jazz musicians, explicitly cited by Kagan and Mandelis, and alluded to by Coleman when he spoke of the painter doing what he was doing, is the improvisational nature of their creativity. Indeed, spontaneous invention is the hallmark of both free jazz and Pollock's working method. But of course, Pollock was dead before Coleman came on the scene. Obviously, in Coleman's case, the influence was one way in that direction, the direction of the musician. Whether classic jazz provided a formal model for Pollock is debatable, since it typically begins with an established melody, the basic tune from which the players take off. Pollock, who subscribed to Carl Gustav Jung's theory of the creative unconscious, began with a blank canvas. He had no framework other than his imagination on which to hang his inventions. In effect, he built the framework intuitively as he went along. As the critic Harold Rosenberg summarized the process in his famous 1952 essay, The American Action Painters, The image was not preconceived, but evolved as a result of the artist's encounter with his materials. Quote, each stroke had to be a decision and was answered by a new question. The likelihood is that however much Pollock admired jazz as an art form, enjoyed listening to it, and even looked to it as a stimulus to work, he didn't want his art to be too closely identified with it. On the only occasion when he had the opportunity to pair music with his painting, jazz was not the genre he chose. In 1950, the photographer Hans Namath, who had taken hundreds of still photographs of Pollock at work, decided to make a movie of the painter in action. After experimenting with black and white film inside the studio, he shot color footage outdoors, where Pollock painted a long canvas on the ground. That's what you see him doing here. And that canvas was ultimately discarded. And he made a collage painting on glass. And that one did survive. It's in the museum in Ottawa. And that was done following the long red one, which did not survive. Working with cinematographer Paul Falkenberg, and you can see the film, by the way, the color film on YouTube. Namath edited it and added a short narration read by Pollock. In his description of the project, Falkenberg explained, quote, we felt that this film was Jackson's and that if any voice were to accompany the picture, it should be his, end quote. They also gave him the say regarding music. To Falkenberg, the swirling elements then here's a very similar painting on red canvas, similar to the one that was discarded. The swirling elements in Pollock's paintings suggested the loose structured sound sequences of a gamelan orchestra. So he created a soundtrack using excerpts from recordings of Indonesian music. Quote, when I ran the film with it for Jackson, Falkenberg recalled, he said, but Paul, this is exotic music. I'm an American painter, unquote. Yet he didn't recommend using jazz, the music most readily identified as typically American. Back to square one, the filmmakers approached John Cage to compose an original score, but Cage declined on the grounds that he didn't like the artist or his art. Cage advised them to ask his young protege, Morton Feldman, with whom Pollock soon formed an intense friendship. Feldman, who saw Pollock paint in person, in addition to watching the footage, told Pollock's biographer, Jeffrey Potter, that he scored the film as he would for choreography, with 2 interwoven tracks of cello music written specifically in response to Pollock's movements. And here is part of the score. It may have been true, as Krasner maintained, that Pollock was a lousy dancer, but when he painted, he was grace itself. According to Daniel Stern, who played both cello parts, Feldman, quote, really adapted the sounds to what was happening on the screen, unquote. Obviously, no pre-existing piece of music, jazz or any other form, would correspond so directly. In his essay for my anthology, Such Desperate Joy, Imagining Jackson Pollock, Stern described the piece as, quote, intentional fragments that come together as a coherent whole, similar to the way Pollock's work is made. What Morty was looking for and found was an objective correlative to Pollock's act of painting, unquote. If there is a direct correspondence between Pollock's work and jazz, I believe it's to be found on the technical level, in the mastery of the artist's medium. Those who accuse both Pollock's paintings and vanguard jazz of being chaotic failed to appreciate what Feldman realized, that there was form and structure in Pollock's presumed randomness, in the same way that jazz improvisation is based on rhythmic and harmonic underpinnings. Moreover, just as a dancer works for years to make the most taxing performance seem effortless, Years of practice lie behind Pollock's spontaneous gestures and the jazz musician's inventive artistry. In an effort to answer critics who saw him as undisciplined, Pollock insisted, "I can control the flow of the paint, and there is no accident." Like the jazz giants whose music he loved, he relied on consummate skill to realize his expressive potential. And there's a correlation on an even deeper level. Quote, "The emotion he uses liberates the rhythms and the meters," unquote. That statement is from Ornette Coleman, and although he's referring to Ed Blackwell's drumming on Free Jazz, he might as well have been describing Pollock painting autumn rhythm. Thank you. And if anyone has any questions, I will be happy to answer.
Thank you so much, Helen. Please feel free to put any questions in the chat, or if you want to use the little hand raise feature, I'm happy to call on you or just unmute yourself, however you want to do it. Yeah, go ahead, Richard.
Okay, so I have a question, and I hope you don't think it's impertinent. I love Pollock's later work. His action paintings are some of my favorite paintings. And I've gone to see them over and over again. And I've been out to the museum as well a number of times. But I've always thought that part of the reason he went in this direction was, while he was a master at this, he wasn't really good as a craftsman previously.
So what is the question?
So, well, I wonder if so too, well, perhaps.
Oh, okay. I lost a couple of words there, but I think you're asking if I agree about his craftsmanship or lack of it.
Yeah, prior to taking up abstraction.
Well, you know, it's interesting because he often in the literature on Pollock, you'll read statements like, "Oh, he was a lousy draftsman. He couldn't draw. He was awkward. He just didn't know how to work in a conventional way. So that's why he started doing unconventional work where he didn't have to draw." But I disagree. First of all, if you look at student drawings, not only Pollock's, but many of his contemporaries and even up to today, they can be pretty awkward and pretty much not fluent, not fully realized as works of art. But in Pollock's case, I think you'll often find that in some of his early work where there are still visible figurative elements, his drawing or his depiction of the subject that he's after is actually quite good. And particularly when you get into the pictographic works of where he's using symbolic forms, that seems to have been more his métier than trying to recreate something in a naturalistic way. He was not very good at that, but then neither was Cézanne, to be brutally frank about it. And we all admire what Cézanne actually wound up doing. And in fact, I feel that if Pollock had been a better draftsman, he might have been a lesser painter, because he might have gotten stuck in the fluency of being able to do that. But he found an alternative way of drawing in space using the liquid material that, you know, when you start looking at the beautiful composition of Autumn Rhythm, you can see how his draftsmanship was just expressed in a different medium. And that was what enabled it to come through. And also, you know, people think he used house paint because it was cheap or for whatever reason. It wasn't like he couldn't paint with conventional paint. Well, he did use conventional paint, and he often combined it with the liquid material, but the house paint gave him the effect he was after. You know, you use whatever material you can. He said it himself, it doesn't matter how the paint is put on, as long as something is being said. So it enabled him to make the statement that he wanted to make in visual terms. I hope that answers your question.
Well, it pretty much and you for your time. I would just quibble that Cézanne turned out some masterpieces.
He certainly did. But he was a very awkward draftsman, and if you look at his early drawings, you can see how much he struggled.
Yeah, but I'm not talking about the draftsmanship. I'm talking about objective paintings. I probably didn't phrase my original question correctly, well enough. But I was talking about Pollock's earlier efforts to be an objective painter, a naturalist painter, to use the word that you used. And to my eyes, he's a failure in that, and Cézanne certainly is not.
No, no, I agree with you. But I don't think Pollock was so much a failure as it was, it wasn't the direction, it wasn't the right direction for him. There's actually a beautiful little landscape coming up for auction on October 5th that he did in 1936, when he was still very much under the influence of Thomas Hart Benton. And I think if you look at it online, it's at the Freeman auction in Philadelphia, you'll find it's quite a lovely little picture, and something that I think even someone like Cézanne would have admired.
I'll take a look at it. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, quote here.
I think I saw William first. Go
Yes.
ahead.
It was interesting and disappointing to hear that Pollock didn't relate to the contemporary jazz of his time. You mentioned Lamar Bearden and Stuart Davis. Did any of the other people in the abstract expressionist movement listen to or were influenced by the contemporary jazz as they worked? Or?
Well, as I mentioned, Motherwell and Gottlieb both were in that Samuel Coots exhibition, and they were very interested. Mark Tobey also. So yes, I'd say that, and I'm not sure about Philip Guston. I don't know, maybe Ellen knows more about that. But jazz was very popular. Many people went to the jazz concerts in New York. They went to the Blue Note and the other jazz clubs quite regularly.
William, may I ask what that flower is behind?
Beautiful.
It doesn't grow in my garden. It's just a virtual background from, actually, it's from someplace in Africa.
No, I knew it was, and
I don't know, I couldn't tell you.
But it's nonetheless beautiful.
But it's nicer than the room you would see if I had it turned off.
Ellen, I saw you had your hand up, and I know.
Okay. With regard to Guston, Morton Feldman was one of his best friends. But of course, Morton Feldman famously stopped talking to him when he started doing the Klan and other cartoony pictures, and never talked to him again for the whole rest of his life.
Really? Huh, that's
Yeah.
interesting. I didn't know that.
But I mean, he was very close with Morton Feldman. They were teaching at the New York Studio School. Morton Feldman was the dean at that time. He was very close to them. I wanted to make an observation, which has to do actually with the slide that you have on the screen, because when Pollock was painting the sort of 1950 paintings, the so-called classical paintings, when he finished one, he and Lee propped them up on the wall of the studio, so that, as you can see in that picture, he's painting with his another painting behind him.
Right.
Okay, and to me anyway, it makes a not an influence, but a kind of a parallel with the way in which when you listen to jazz, you lost yourself and you were completely surrounded by the music. So that to a certain degree, I think that some of these some of these photographs that Namath did, like kind of set up an analogy, I suppose, because I really think that he must have been influenced by his own works that were actually, he was in an environment, so to speak, that his own works make. I mean, I love that. That's an awesome picture.
Well, that's certainly true of a lot of artists. They don't like to have an empty studio. They like to have the works around them so they can have a visual point of reference, and also that one often leads to another. Many artists work in series, and so they like to have those points of reference visible.
But his are so big
Yeah.
that he's like, you know, I think it was Alan Capro said, "Little man in big C." In describing Pollock. I mean, he really, you can, this picture kind of really makes that point, that he's in this kind of environment of his own creativity. And I think that some jazz musicians kind of get into that kind of same kind of groove. So I like what you said, and I kind of like that made me think in those directions.
Yeah, that's why I think it's more about process than it is about
exactly.
the music being something that he was physically responding to while he was working, because that, I think, is just an unfortunate assumption that really isn't true.
And it kind of almost translates the improvisational quality of music and the sort of get into the groove quality. It almost kind of translates it from one sense to another, you know, from hearing to seeing, which is one of the reasons why his works are so amazing.
Well, the very fact that if we are to believe Alfonso, and I certainly do, that he was looking at his paintings while he was paintings that he'd already finished 2 years earlier, and looking at them, listening to the music, and trying to get the juices flowing, trying to get some stimulation there when he was in such dire straits. It seems like the music had real meaning for him on more than just an entertainment level, that this was something that he really very, very closely identified with.
I agree.
But as Alfonso said, it was early jazz, not bebop or progressive.
Very good.
I see Richard Miller had a hand up, I think.
Oh, okay, can you hear me? First of all, thank you so much for this presentation. I've been looking forward to this, answering these questions for a long time with Pollock's work and with jazz, etc. And so hearing some of the artists that you were mentioning, you know, early jazz, but then, okay, some of the big band things, the Bassies, the Shaw, Herman, a lot of those were sort of transitional bands about 45, 46, when he really starts shifting into the paintings that we know and love him most for. And they were sort of a mixture of where music was going, but also still holding on to that sort of swing essence.
Mm-hmm.
And when you said that Lee Krasner thought that he listened to the music as a kind of an escape or a relief from the work of painting, I think that may be why I think he still gravitated towards the earlier jazz and the big band things more so than the bop, because the bop was what he was doing. And that wasn't an escape.
Oh, I see.
That was like in
idea.
your face kind of thing. Mm-hmm. The other thing that I've always, wondered, with the earlier jazz up through, like I said, the swing artists, their improvisation was improvising against the melody.
Right.
Whereas bop improvised against the chord structure, not the melody.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the similarity, he's improvising against the structure of the painting, the structure of the canvas, the structure of the medium, not the melody, which would be like a literal image.
Yeah.
Kind of thing. But I don't know, what do you think of that? I mean, maybe the bop music, the really contemporary stuff, late 40s, 50s, was just too close.
That is a very interesting idea, and I think it definitely has merit. But also remember, it's sort of like most of us, the music you grew up with is still the music that really moves you. And so, those of us who remember the birth of rock and roll, that to us is popular music, and maybe we're not so interested in the more contemporary stuff. But I think that the idea that you have a more lyrical approach in some of the earlier music might be an influence, but the fact that people would automatically, like Ruth Kligman, automatically assumed that he would go for bebop because it was so close to what he was doing. And if he was going to reject that, I think you're onto something. Oh, I see Cheryl Rubin has a question, but could she be unmuted? She's in the chat box, but she didn't put the question into the chat box.
Oh, I think
Claire,
she's unmuted.
Sorry, yeah, for some reason on my Mac, I don't have a little hand raise icon. But it's actually my husband, Dave, who has a question or a comment.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, hi. Anyway, thanks, Miss Harrison, for doing this. We've actually met you out at the Springs.
Yes, indeed.
And we're a fan of the Pollock and of you as well. Full disclosure, I am a musician and a guitar player. And I had a bit of an epiphany here tonight listening to you. And so I'm going to phrase it in the form of a question. That maybe the way why he liked the early jazz better, especially like the Dixieland. Everybody, the early Louis Armstrong, etc., all those musicians are all playing at the same time. When you get to later jazz, you have a rhythm section and then the soloists take their turn. And then playing over top of it, they may reference a melody if it's a standard that they're turning into bebop for particularly. But I see a connection, if you agree, between again the early jazz that he likes is more like his paintings, where it's complete and he has all these forms going on at the same time and interlocking, which really to me is the visual. It could be the visual result of that early jazz that he likes.
Now, that had never occurred to me, but now that you say it, sort of like what Richard said, the idea that the early music has more of a psychic relationship to what he was doing, that he might feel more in tune with it. That's an interesting conjecture, and it's a little bit different from what Richard said, but he identified with it more. It's very possible because his work is very layered, and of course once you've created the image, everything is happening at once. It's static, but it's a record of all the movements, all the gestures, all the energy that he put into it. So that's a very interesting thought.
And the layers of the paint, like the layers of the instruments, which is happens more.
I hadn't given much thought to the idea of the fact that the early jazz is, as you say, everyone's playing at once rather than the soloists taking their turn.
I mean, there are solos, but everybody's still playing.
But they're still playing in the background, except not just the bass guy who's keeping the rhythm or just a drummer, but all the instruments.
Right, and they're interlocking, and there's layers, like there's layers with his forms, there's layers of that music, which you don't have so much in the later jazz. It's a little different. Maybe, I don't know. I thought of it as you were talking about it.
Well, I'm glad that I gave you the idea. Well, I didn't really give you the idea, but you got the idea, and I'm very interested in that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
There's a question in the chat from Richard Miller. Did he have any Glenn Miller records in the collection?
I believe there are some. The entire record collection has been inventoried, and it is available on our website. If you go to the Study Center and scroll down under the Art Reference Library, there's a link to the PDF that has everything listed. Some of the records, of course, belong to Krasner. So those are the later ones, the Modern Jazz Quartet, the Thelonious Monk, But she also has some, the larger, the 12-inch 33 1/3 that duplicate some of the old 78s, the Louis Armstrong, the Billie Holiday. So there was an overlap there. But there are also some very interesting records that are not music. There's James Joyce reading from Anna Livia Pluribel. There's also, I believe, Dylan Thomas doing a spoken word poetry record. There's also an Indian sitar music that has an inscription on it it's dedicated to Jackson in handwriting, not the record itself, but the sleeve. So this was given to him by the Indian music artist. And things that, there are oddities like that that don't fit into the regular jazz collection, but they are all listed on the website. Anyone else? I see there's one in the chat. Oh yeah, that was the Glenn Miller. Well, I really appreciate everyone sharing this with me, and thank you so much all for coming. If there are no other questions, I'll just mention that our series continues on October 13th with the painter Christian White, who is the great-grandson of Stanford White, the architect, who will be giving a talk about how to reconcile modernism and realism. And then on the 27th, we have Nancy Moses. She's the author of Fakes, Frauds, and Forgeries, or is it Forgeries, Fakes, and Frauds, a book about authentication, the authentication process and its pitfalls, not just dealing with Pollock, but a variety of different genres of authentication. And it's a fascinating book. She really knows her stuff. So I hope that you will come and listen to both of those. And again, thank you to Claire for co-hosting this series with me.
Thank you, Helen. I do see one hand sneaking up.
Well, maybe two.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Richard, if you were.
Well, I was just after all these talks, I was like, do we have any knowledge of, when he was painting, was he quiet? Did he talk? Did he verbalize? Or did he just sort of get into a zone? Because I mean, all we have are photographs and, the silent film footage, but,
Yeah, because the sound was not recorded.
Yeah.
In the color film. The sound was recorded afterwards and it was overdubbed. It was not recorded at the time. It doesn't really look like he's talking or making noise. It looks like he's just concentrating. And it's interesting, the photographer Martha Holmes, who took the photographs for Life magazine, I knew her. She was a lovely person, and she did not promote herself. So a lot of people think that it was Hans Namath who took those pictures, but it wasn't. It was Martha. And she apparently was in the studio and watching him at work. And she didn't have a wide angle lens. She had a Graflex, I think, and, a smaller camera. And I asked her, because she got up pretty close to him, and I asked her if it was annoying to him that someone was there photographing him. And she was from the South, and she said, honey, he didn't even know I was in the room. So there was a kind of focus, a concentration that blotted out everything else. And I think he probably was silent while he was working. Unless he, dropped something and swore. William.
I just wanted to say, under the "it's an ill will that blows no one good" category, I guess if things were normal, these talks would be given live at Southampton campus of the university. This way, I'm able to see them at home in Setauket, since I'm a retired professor at Stony Brook. So
that's the advantage.
Yeah. So though I wish we weren't in this situation, I'm happy to be able to take advantage of this program this year. Thank you.
Yeah, but after that, I'm all the way down here in Texas.
And Ellen is all the way in California.
California, Los Angeles.
Well, thank you all again. It's been a real pleasure to share this with you, and I hope we'll see you again on the 13th.